So here comes the least fun part with API Gateway, which is around security, but the exam really needs you to know all the security aspects of API Gateway. So here it is. There are three aspects. There is IAM permissions, Lambda authorizers, and there's Cognito user pool. We're going to go see them one by one. The first one is IAM permissions. So basically you're in AWS, and so if you want to give one of your user, one of your role access to your API, that makes sense to attach an IAM policy to your user and your role, and then what happens is that the API gateway will verify the IAM permissions when you call your REST API, and it's really good if you want to provide API access within your own infrastructure. It's a really good way of doing things. The magic is called SigV4 for signature v4, and so the IAM credentials, it's a bit complicated, but they are in one header, and the header is passed on to the API gateway. So we have our client, it's calling API gateway with SigV4, and then API gateway calls IAM, verifies the policies, make sure it all checks out, and then if it's happy, goes to the backend. So if we talk about the advantages, there's no added cost to this solution. And anytime you see SigV4 in the exam, think IAM permissions for API gateway. So it's a pretty easy solution, but if you give access to users outside of your AWS, then you can't use IAM permissions, obviously. The second thing that is probably the most common you're going to see out there is Lambda authorizer, and it was used to be known as custom authorizer. So if you see in the exam custom authorizers, think Lambda authorizer. And so as the name indicates, it uses Amazon Lambda to validate the token that is being passed in the header of your request. And you can cache the result of your authentication. So you don't need to call your authorizer Lambda every time a request comes in, just once, and then you can cache the result for say 1 hour. It's used when you have some kind of third-party type authentication, OAuth, SAML, etc. And so anytime you need to evaluate the credentials given by a third party, Lambda authorizer is a great candidate for this. And the Lambda, as a result of your authorization, must return an IAM policy for the user, and that IAM policy will define whether or not the user can call the API. So fairly easy. Now our client calls the REST API with a token, a third-party token, and our API gateway will call the Lambda authorizer, passing the token to the Lambda authorizer, and the Lambda will return an IAM policy. And if everything checks out, then the API gateway talks to the backend, and we're good. Now we have a third kind of users, and this is the user pools for Cognito. Now there's a whole section on Cognito, so don't get afraid too much. Right now, let's just assume we know what user pools are, and so Cognito will manage the full user lifecycle, and the API gateway will automatically verify the identity from AWS Cognito, and you don't need to implement any custom Lambda function or anything, so it's all implemented for you and free. But the only thing to know is that Cognito only helps this time with authentication, not authorization. So Cognito just says, yes, the user talking to you right now is who is indeed the right user. So the process is that your client calls the Cognito user pool to authenticate, and then the Cognito user pool gives back a token to the client. The client now calls our API gateway as a REST API, and it passes on the token and just received the Cognito user pool. And the API gateway will then make sure that the Cognito token is correct by talking to Cognito directly. And then when it's happy, it says, okay, we can now talk to the backend. But the backend must ensure that you are authorized to make the call. So this time is a little bit different. So in this type of solution, you manage your own user pool. So this is going to be great when we see Cognito, because we can see how we can enable Facebook or Google authentication with that scheme. And that gives you the third kind of authentication for the API gateway. So let's just summarize and understand which scheme to use and when. So the first one is going to be IAM, and IAM is for when you have users or roles already within your AWS account. It's handling authentication and authorization through IAM policies, and it leverages SigV4. If you use a custom authorizer, it's great when you have third-party tokens that you don't control, and you are very flexible in terms of what IAM policy is going to be returned. You can handle authentication and authorization because you return an IAM policy, and you're going to pay per Lambda invocation, but you can use caching to limit the number of calls you do to your Lambda function for authorizing. But if you have 1 million users, then you'll have to call your Lambda function 1 million times every time the cache gets invalidated. For Cognito user pools, then you're going to manage your own user pool, and we'll see this in Cognito when we go to the section of Cognito, next section. You can be backed by Facebook login, Google login, etc. And so you don't need to write any custom code, and you must implement the authorization layer on the backend. So Cognito will just provide you an authentication pattern, not an authorization pattern. So I hope that helps, and I will see you in the next lecture.